Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Nick. Welcome back to the Sympathizer Let's Read that we are working through right now. We are currently on chapter 15 of the Sympathizer. This chapter is super dense, I think. Probably one of the denser chapters that we've gotten in the book so far. It really is a lot of conversation here. All the important stuff happens through conversation. So kind of similar to how we did just a little bit of a play-by-play that worked in through a deep dive not last time, but 2 episodes ago, I want to say. We're going to do something similar with that today. So we'll go through our regular bare bones summary, and then our play-by-play summary is going to be a little bit more in depth than usual. But yeah, it's pretty much the same type of situation that we've been dealing with thus far. So let's get straight into the bare bones summary for chapter 15. So the chapter starts with Bowen and the Sympathizer discussing the Sympathizer's budding relationship with Lana. The Sympathizer considers the history of corporal punishment in Vietnam. The General and the Sympathizer attend a fundraising meeting at the country club with the congressman and some of his constituents, including one Dr. Richard Head, who is the author of the book on Asian communism that the Sympathizer and Mon use to encode their messages. So like I said, there's not really a ton of events that go on in this chapter. It's more so just conversations that kind of happen, and the events of the chapter, I think, are going to be more or less felt throughout the following chapters, but for this one, it really is just more exposition and kind of character building. And yeah, let's kind of get into a little bit more of a play-by-play of the chapter, and that will kind of lead into and more or less be the deep dive for the episode as well. So like I said kind of at the beginning, this chapter is pretty dense. So for the most part, I think that the play-by-play will kind of suffice as the deep dive, because really the only most important thing that happens in this chapter is the country club meeting. So we'll go through that a little bit, kind of line by line almost, and just really get into the depths of that conversation, because it really is pretty dense. And like I said, there really isn't much outside of the kind of country club episode that happens in this chapter, so we'll kind of cross that bridge when we come to it. And as things come up throughout the conversation, as I remember things, or as I have kind of comments and critiques, not necessarily critiques, but comments and stuff like that, I will voice those as they come up. So like I said before, the chapter starts with Bowen and the Sympathizer discussing his attempts to woo Lana. He mentions that he's writing letters to her in perfect cursive. He's writing poetry to her, which is not really that great. He's singing her songs by popular Vietnamese artists. He's kind of throwing everything at the wall and hoping that something sticks. He seemingly is no closer than before, unfortunately, as his only repayment for all of these advances is a front row seat reserved for him to all of Lana's performances. Bowen and the Sympathizer discuss this relationship, and Bowen comments on the fact that there's no way that the situation ends positively. He is kind of convinced that the General will figure things out, and the ramifications for the Sympathizer are going to be less than stellar. He knows that the General would never really accede to the Sympathizer dating his daughter, but the Sympathizer is not really concerned with the courtship ending in a relationship. He says, "What's so wrong with the courtship ending in love?" And Bond kind of scoffs at this, saying that relationships really are not about love, that they're about marriage. And I think that this is kind of an Eastern perspective on kind of relationships and marriage in general, whereas the Sympathizer is coming to it with a more Western perspective, I want to say, which I think is interesting for the kind of juxtaposition of the Sympathizer as an Eastern person and as well as a Western person. During this conversation, the two are kind of keeping an eye on a pair of teenagers that are shoplifting in the liquor store, and Bond eventually confronts them with a baseball bat, but not before uttering one of my favorite lines in the chapter. He says, "You know what makes us human? What makes us human is that we're the only creatures on this planet that can fuck ourselves." So I think that line is really, really rad. I also think that it's funny coming from Bond, who, I think that for the most part, things that kind of happened to him, a lot of the decisions that have been made in the story are kind of outside of his own control. And therefore, a lot of the kind of stuff that happens to him really does happen to him. He is kind of down on his luck. He's not really got the best thing going for himself right now, but I don't really think that it's too much his fault. At this point, the Sympathizer kind of reflects on the nature of corporal punishment in Vietnam that kind of permeated all layers of Vietnamese society during his upbringing. Young people were beaten at home and then at school in order to kind of keep them in line. He says, parents and teachers beating students like Persian rugs to shake the dust of complacency and stupidity out of them. I think that's a really fire line as well. I think that, when he's considering these two young American people, he's kind of chastising the American upbringing system for not using corporal punishment on these two young people, so they don't have the kind of fear in them, which we'll get into. He recalls his father beating him and his fellow students during their school years and the importance of original sin in the sentencing of crimes. It's kind of difficult to understand why someone would discipline a child that way, but in the eyes of the Catholic Church, with original sin, everyone is kind of worthy of punishment regardless of their circumstances in life. The Sympathizer then considers the two great motivators for belief, fear and love. He says that the two young men knew fear, but he wonders whether or not that they knew love, which was much harder to teach. All right, now we really get into the nitty-gritty of the chapter. Kind of the most important stuff goes on from this point on. The general arrives at the liquor store at his usual time, but he and the Sympathizer are immediately off to a meeting. The general's quiet as usual, only asking for the Sympathizer to turn down the music. The Sympathizer considers the origins of his contemplation and lands on the Sunny problem. He recalls the story about the movement having been circulated around the Vietnamese expat community as of late, and that the gossip has surely reached the Madame and by extension the general. There are many different stories about the movement floating around, and the general has most likely heard all of them. Also at this point, the Sympathizer suffers from another hallucination. The crapulent major, third eye still weeping, joins the men in the car. He speaks to the Sympathizer, telling him that he can't wait to see how this story ends up. He says some stuff later on as well. But the Sympathizer is kind of chastised by the general for talking to himself at this point, which I think is a really funny interaction. And it causes the Sympathizer to kind of go on a little diatribe about the nature and the value of a person talking to themselves. I think that this segment is the most, I hesitate to say insane, because obviously the Sympathizer is coherent and, all this stuff is normal for the most part. But the most abnormal segment that we've gotten from the Sympathizer, I think part of the reason why he kind of ruminates on this topic is because he's retelling the story while he's in jail. And going on this kind of paranoid reverie about the value of being able to talk to yourself is not really a coincidence, because I don't think that he's really interacting with many other people in his day-to-day life and is therefore forced to kind of talk to himself a lot. The Major continues to torment the Sympathizer as he considers the existence of God, and he comments on his mother's death and the fact that he believed at the time of his mother's passing that if God were real, then his father would be the one who was dead instead of his mother. The two arrive at the country club and are surprised to find a pretty normal-looking steakhouse in Anaheim. He and the general are led into a private room on the second floor, where the congressman, Dr. Head, and 5 other businessmen and dignitaries await their arrival. Dr. Head is in town on a lecture tour, and he is kind of the main attraction of the evening, him and the congressman, which is what the Sympathizer says. Getting him in the same room as the general was kind of the chief purpose of the meeting, and he being the congressman, cites Head's ability to open doors and pocketbooks for the general's cause. So this is definitely a case of the congressman kind of pulling some strings and, getting a meeting of the minds together to help out with the movement in a non-official way, more or less. The Sympathizer wastes no time in presenting Dr. Head with his much-used copy of the book. The book mentioned, of course, is the one that Mon and the Sympathizer use to encode their messages through the Ant in Paris. So it's quite obvious to us, the reader, why the volume is so dog-eared and shabby. The Sympathizer impresses Dr. Head early on with his turns of phrase, and he honestly continues to dazzle throughout the night. I think this is some of the best Sympathizer work that we get in this situation, and I think that him coming face to face with Dr. Head is a really interesting and unique situation that I really did not see coming. So to have Dr. Head show up and for him to be impressed by the Sympathizer, I think is really, really awesome. So from here, we get a couple of excerpts from Dr. Head's book, a couple passages showing the difference between the two types of Asian communists and the dangers that each present. The average Viet Cong fighter and the Vietnamese radical intellectual. The Sympathizer considers himself to fall into the latter category and remarks that yes, Head is right when he assumes that this category is the most dangerous foe. The Sympathizer considers the recto, which is right, and the verso, which is left, sides of himself, once again playing into the kind of man of two faces motif that we've been working throughout this entire book. Just another brick in the wall of the theme of the man of two faces. The Sympathizer briefly outlines Head's importance to the American federal government as an advisor who frequently espouses the value of bombing. He naturally found fans in men like the congressman whose districts produce the planes and the bombs that are used for these attacks. And the conversation really, honestly, naturally flows to the kind of role of America in global politics, particularly in combating Asian communism. Head utilizes his experience from World War II of fighting the Japanese in Burma and mentions that over 1 million Vietnamese died in a famine that the Japanese kind of caused during the war. No kidding is really all the table can muster at this news of such an injustice happening. It kind of causes the Sympathizer to consider the fact that the two Vietnamese men at the table have become, unfortunately at this point, nothing more than a spectacle. They're kind of a representation of this disaster that the American men at the table, and Dr. Head is English, so by extension Dr. Head as well, that these white men at the table kind of have to confront, when it's just statistics and it's in a book, like, it doesn't really matter, but when you have two people who are actually from that place that could have potential links to that disaster, it becomes a little bit less ethereal, let's say. Another great Sympathizer moment here, he definitely calms the room down, stating that most Vietnamese people are less concerned on the past and they're more focused on becoming Americans. At this point, Head and the Sympathizer kind of get into a bit of a thought experiment, I would say, because it's not really an argument and it's a little bit more, it's a little deeper than just like a regular conversation. Dr. Head poses the question, a simple question really, to the Sympathizer. He asks him whether or not he's happy. At this point, the Sympathizer kind of considers the implications of the question. He takes a little while to respond. He's saved by the arrival of the waiters who are bringing the main course to the table, but intrepid Head, of course, he repeats the question immediately once the waiters have left the table, and the Sympathizer unfortunately responds with a double negative. He says, "I'm not unhappy," which it doesn't really go over great, but I mean, there's not really anything else that he could say at this point, Head lets the Sympathizer off pretty easy at this point, and he states that he is not unhappy because he's simply pursuing happiness and has not yet attained it, which is the reason that why Dr. Head kind of lets him off the hook. That's what he says in his agreement, more or less. The Sympathizer then poses the question to Dr. Head, and Head remarks on the nature of American happiness. He comments on the fact that for someone to be happy in America, he must measure his happiness against that of someone else. If he says that he is happy, then that means he's happier than someone, and that someone may be present in the room with them. But if he says he is unhappy, then the room becomes uneasy because nobody is supposed to be unhappy in America. So this kind of causes a bit of a gloom to fall over the room. Head is an Englishman, like I said, so he's able to kind of play into the latent Anglophilia and inferiority complex of the American men. But the general swoops in, more Vietnamese, saving the Americans. A nice little reversal, I guess, of the typical or the historical precedent. The general says, if happiness is not guaranteed, then freedom is, and that, gentlemen, is way more important. So the general, like I said, swooping in, saving the day, making sure everyone feels good about themselves in order to open up their pocketbooks. So the congressman finally at this point breaks the ice and retells the reason that all the men are gathered here this evening. He lauds the South Vietnamese soldier as the kind of bulwark against communism that saved Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, Japan, and as reminded by Dr. Head, Indonesia as well. He says that the commitment of the South Vietnamese soldier should be rewarded with something more than simple gratitude. He introduces, at this point, the general as one of the finest guardians of freedom that Indochina has ever known. The general begins his practiced speech on the value of the arsenal of democracy. He mentions that the Vietnam War was not really the war that they know it to be, but more of a battle in the Cold War between tyranny and liberty. He's quickly interrupted by Head, though, who states that yes, there is still trouble in Southeast Asia, but there are issues in the world that are honestly of more concern right now. He says the Palestinians, the Red Brigades, the Soviets. He comments on the rising terror threats in Germany, Israel, and Italy, finishing by saying that Afghanistan is the new Vietnam. So I think that this is important because it shows how quickly the public perspective can shift between conflicts, right? We just got out of that last one and we're already concerning ourselves with where we can go to next and where we have to devote our resources and our attention for the next fight. So I just think that that's an interesting and unfortunate situation because realistically, it's important that we take care of ourselves, right? That we focus on things that are going on within our four walls rather than turning our attention elsewhere. But unfortunately, we're unable to do that. The Western perspective is really unable to do that, unfortunately. Sympathizer then goes into a bit of a monologue about the nature of the non-white person in white America and how whites are pretty easily scared by foreigners. Non-whites enmesh themselves into American society. They embrace the culture in order to kind of maintain relevance and understanding, but they continue to study the anthropological hallmarks of said culture. The Sympathizer states that they are the greatest anthropologists of the American people, but the American people would never know that because the notes that are written on them are written in their mother tongue. So I think that this is an important topic as well. The importance, the anthropological importance of the non-white person in white America. The value of the perspective in having to change yourself in order to feel welcomed and, like you belong in America. The general kind of rebukes Dr. Head in his own words by stating that the Soviets are more like Asiatics who never learn Western ways. This is from the Sympathizer's debrief that the general received of Dr. Head's work, and so he's kind of chuffed to see that it gets taken out and used at this point. The Sympathizer offers that Head is absolutely correct in stating that the Soviets should be confronted, and when asked why by Dr. Head, the congressman comes in and responds with the poignant words of John Quincy Adams. He says, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. America is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all." So we get a little bit into the American interventionalism, policy, nature, whatever you want to call it. The fact that America can't stop sticking her freaking nose into everything. It's because of people like the Congressman and John Quincy Adams, and Dr. Head is kind of, he talks about how great Quincy Adams is, and he says that even an Englishman can't deny JQA. So it's just a bit of a play on that kind of policy and those kinds of ideas that are still relevant today. They're current. People are still feeling this way. We're still working in this manner, etc., etc. The conversation then transitions to the eventual failure of the Vietnam War, and the group comment on the nature of the communist dictator, as written by Dr. Head. After a few million have died, what's a few million more, right? The general and Dr. Head conversed about the nature of war in the Orient and the fact that human lives are an inexhaustible resource in Asia. Head remarks that life in the Orient is cheap, plentiful, and unimportant, and a kind of silence descends on the room while the waiters refresh cocktails. When the sympathizer is kind of questioned about his thoughts on Head's theory, he definitely responds that life is valuable in the Orient, but it is invaluable to the Westerner. Head simply raises his glass and agrees with the sympathizer's comments. The conversation exhausts itself, and the sympathizer finally asks about the country club. Amused, the congressman and the head waiter lead the men into a wood-paneled room down the hall. Beautiful women welcome the men into the room, and the chapter ends with Head asking the sympathizer permission to use his turn phrase in his next book. Whoa, lots going on, lots to kind of sift through. Like I said, there's some stuff here that might require someone with a little bit more understanding of Asian geopolitics, as well as, the history of American intervention and policy theory and all that other kind of garbage that I really don't know too much about and don't really feel comfortable kind of getting into at this point. As far as the implications go for the story itself, though, this chapter is really dense, and it's an interesting departure from the rest of the book, where we kind of get a lot of events in every chapter, and if we're not really getting a lot of events, then we're going to a lot of different places, and if we're not going to a lot of different places, then we're getting a lot of something. And this chapter, I think we're getting a lot of kind of theory, and this is the most prime example, I think, in this book of the commentary on the reality of the American political system, right? Decisions are not made in Congress. They're not made on, the floor of the Senate. They're not made at this point, and even to a certain extent, currently, decisions are not made in those places of power. They're made in back rooms, in steakhouses, by wealthy men who are having conversations about, playing with millions of lives. I think that that's kind of the most important takeaway that we can get from this situation, from this chapter, is that this is a commentary on the kind of nature of power and the distribution of power, or not really distribution, but the accumulation of power through wealth, through proximity to power, through, et cetera, et cetera. I think that that's kind of the most important thing that we can kind of glean from this chapter, is that the sympathizer is kind of walking into the lion's den here, and he's getting a peek behind the curtain, more or less, to see the real nature of American politics and the kind of way that the American political system works in a more realistic way. Because obviously, he knows what voting is, and he knows, he's been to the congressman's office, so he sees, the staffers, and he understands kind of the structure of the political system, and he's been to college, he's educated, but he doesn't have firsthand experience with the realities of American politics, and I think that this is his most confrontational, not really confrontational, this is his most authentic view of the reality of American politics that I think that he's gotten, and by extension that we've gotten through his eyes and from his perspective. So I think that really is where the most value from this chapter lies, is just kind of understanding that the Sympathizer is getting used to the nature of the political experience in America. I think that's it for me. That's all that I've got for this chapter. Like I said, super dense, but really, really good. A lot of amazing writing. The conversations are beautiful. The Sympathizer dazzles, like I said, throughout the chapter. So I know that the general is going to be satisfied with the Sympathizer when they go home after this one. Hopefully he stops hallucinating in the car. That does not bode well for his future. These full-on hallucination attacks that he's having. Good stuff. Really good stuff. We are officially past the halfway point. We are on the downstroke of the chapter, or of the story. I feel like the next couple of chapters are really going to kick up. Next chapter is chapter 16, so we only have 16. We've got 7 chapters left. So I think the next couple of chapters are really going to kind of be explosive, and the actual amount of book that is left is very, very small. So we only got that much left. So, like I said, we're going to start to get into a little bit more quick action-oriented stuff, I want to say. I'm really, really excited. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If I missed something, please let me know. I'd be happy to discuss it. Let me know what you thought about this chapter. Let me know what you're excited to see moving forward. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.